She wanted the world to remember her as an actress, elegant, admired, applauded. Instead, history remembers her as a monster. Her life was a performance written in shadows, from a broken childhood to the glittering stages of Shanghai, from Mao Zedong's wife to the ruthless architect of the Cultural Revolution. Jiang Qing didn't just live through history, she performed it. She turned an entire nation into her stage. But this is more than a biography. This is a cautionary tale, a story of ambition sharpened into vengeance, of ideology wielded like a weapon, of a woman who mistook applause for power, and in doing so, helped set her country on fire. Our story begins in 1914, in Shandong province, where a girl named Li Yunhe was born. Her name meant crane in the clouds, a symbol of grace and freedom. But her childhood was anything but graceful, and freedom was nowhere to be found. Her father was a violent alcoholic, decades older than her mother. He raged, drank, and eventually abandoned the family altogether, leaving behind a wife and child with little hope. For young Li, abandonment came early, and it came brutally. Her mother, desperate and cornered, turned to survival in the only way she could. She found companionship with men who provided money and security, sometimes fleeting, sometimes longer. Li often sat at home alone, waiting while her mother returned with another man. These memories would etch themselves deep into the child's mind, shaping her understanding of women's powerlessness in a patriarchal world. For a time, Li was sent to live with her grandparents in Jinan. They tried to provide stability, strictness, and order, but the scars of her early years had already formed. She had seen how women could be humiliated, reduced to dependence, stripped of dignity. And she grew to despise the old ways, the traditions that trapped women in silence. She was not the submissive daughter society demanded. At school, she was fiery, argumentative, unwilling to conform. Teachers found her impossible. Classmates mocked her for her stubbornness. But Li refused to bow her head. Her defiance was her survival. By the time she was a teenager, Li Yunhe was desperate to escape the poverty, shame, and suffocating smallness of her world. At 14, her chance arrived. A traveling theater troupe passed through her town. Where others saw entertainment, Li saw salvation. She ran away with them. For Li, the stage was liberation. Under the lights, she could shed the pain of her childhood and become someone else, anyone else. She could demand attention, demand applause, demand control. For the first time, she wasn't powerless. She was writing her own script. Her grandparents, horrified to discover their granddaughter performing, tried to bring her back. But Li pleaded with them. Performing wasn't a phase, she insisted. It was her destiny. To her surprise, they agreed to a compromise. She could continue, but under their supervision. They even enrolled her at the Academy of Performing Arts in Jinan. The academy should have been her new beginning, but she quickly learned that talent wasn't the only currency in the theater world. Behind the curtain lurked exploitation. The infamous casting couch was an open secret. Directors and patrons demanded favors in exchange for roles. Li had watched her mother suffer in similar ways. She despised the thought, feared it, but also understood the brutal truth. Refusal could mean losing her chance at stardom. Among her classmates, she was an outsider, poor, provincial, wearing threadbare clothes that marked her instantly as different. Other students whispered, mocked her accent, looked down on her background. But instead of shrinking, Li fought back. She masked her insecurities with arrogance, clashed with peers, and refused to blend in. If she couldn't be admired, she would be unforgettable. And unforgettable she was. On stage, her raw talent cut through. The chaos of her life fell away. She wasn't a broken girl anymore. She was someone extraordinary, a performer with the power to hold an audience in her hands. By the early 1930s, Li Yunhe had transformed into a confident young performer, but fate had other plans. In 1930, the Performing Arts Academy shut down. Overnight, her stage disappeared, dreams dissolved, and with little choice, she returned to her grandparents in Jinan. At just 16, she attempted marriage. It was not romance, but resignation, a move pushed by practicality. But domestic life suffocated her. Her in-laws expected obedience, silence, and servitude. Lee was none of those things. Arguments erupted constantly. Within months, the marriage collapsed. She walked away with certainty. She was not made for domesticity. Her restless ambition turned toward a bigger stage, Shanghai. In the 1930s, Shanghai was a dazzling paradox. Neon lights, jazz clubs, foreign concessions, and political unrest all collided in a single city. Nicknamed the Paris of the East, it was glamorous and corrupt, modern and dangerous, a place where women could reinvent themselves in ways impossible elsewhere in China. For Lee, Shanghai wasn't just opportunity, it was destiny.
She clawed her way into the city's underground theater scene. Small roles, meager pay, but each performance kept her dream alive. At the same time, she gravitated toward politics. She performed in anti-government plays, distributed revolutionary pamphlets, and immersed herself in radical student circles. For her, art and rebellion were inseparable, two sides of the same performance. But the authorities weren't impressed. In 1934, she was arrested for subversive activities. For 3 harsh months, she endured prison, her health battered by the conditions. Yet even in solitary confinement, she sang opera to herself, refusing to break. When she emerged, she reinvented herself once again. Goodbye, Li Yunhei. Hello, Lan Ping. The new name, meaning blue apple, was odd, poetic, mysterious. Reinvention was her gift, and this was just another act in the performance of her life. Her breakthrough came in 1935 when she was cast in Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House. Playing Nora, a woman who rebels against a suffocating marriage, Lan Ping wasn't just acting, she was channeling her own life. Her performance was raw, personal, electric. Critics raved, audiences wept. For the first time, Lan Ping was recognized as a real actress, not just another face in the crowd. But success carried shadows. The film industry was rotten with corruption. Directors demanded favors, wealthy patrons expected more than performances. Lan Ping, hardened by her past, refused to bend. Fame, she decided, would not come at the cost of her dignity. Her personal life, however, was a storm. She fell for Tong Na, an art critic with a sharp pen and a volatile personality. Their relationship was passionate, destructive, and loud. When it collapsed, Tong's allies in the press launched attacks. Newspapers smeared her as cold, manipulative, ambitious to the point of cruelty. They blackened her name. Lan Ping struck back with a bold essay titled My Life. Half confession, half manifesto, it exposed the hypocrisy of the film industry and the suffocating grip of men over women's futures. For once, she wasn't just performing lines, she was writing them. Then, in 1937, history tore the curtain down. The Japanese invaded Shanghai. The city's golden age ended in smoke and rubble. Theaters closed, careers vanished. Lan Ping's acting dream ended, destroyed by forces far larger than herself. For a woman addicted to reinvention, there was only one option. She turned her back on acting and walked into politics. The Japanese invasion had crushed Shanghai. Neon lights went dark, jazz clubs silenced, and with them, Lan Ping's career. She needed a new stage, a new script. She found it in Yan'an, the communist base in Shanxi province. For intellectuals and artists, Yan'an was more than a refuge. It was the beating heart of China's revolutionary dream. And for Lan Ping, it was another chance to start over. At 24, she arrived carrying the ashes of her past, 2 failed marriages, a ruined reputation, a dead career. But she also carried ambition, sharper than ever. In Yan'an, she returned to what she knew best, performance. Only this time, the plays were revolutionary dramas glorifying the communist cause. Ideology was spectacle, politics became theater, and Lan Ping was determined to be noticed. But performing wasn't enough. She hadn't run from Shanghai to spend her life reciting lines written by men. She wanted influence, power, a voice. And then came the man who could give her everything. Mao was already a towering figure in the Communist Party, charismatic, cunning, and married to He Zhen, a revolutionary heroine who had marched with him across China. But Mao was also infamous for his affairs, and when he saw Lan Ping perform, he was captivated. A romance began. It was scandalous, explosive, and deeply unpopular. Party officials called her an opportunist, whispered that she was a seductress. Some branded her a prostitute, climbing through scandal. Mao was criticized for recklessness, but Mao was untouchable. His word was law. At a dramatic meeting, Mao declared he could not lead the revolution without her. His political power forced the party to relent, but without conditions. If she wanted to stay by Mao's side, she had to agree to silence. For 30 years of silence. No political role, no voice, no influence, only the part of wife. Lan Ping agreed. Maybe it was love, maybe it was survival, or maybe it was the long game. On Mao's advice, she reinvented once more. She cut her glamorous curls into a severe, cropped style. She took a new name, Jiang Qing, meaning Green River. The actress was gone. Madame Mao was born. To the world, she looked like a loyal, quiet wife, but inside, she simmered. She was rehearsing, waiting for her cue. And one day, when the curtain rose again, she would make sure the whole nation heard her voice.
By the late 1930s, Jiang Qing was no longer just an actress. She was Madame Mao, wife of China's revolutionary leader, Mao Zedong. From the outside, it looked like she had stepped into the pinnacle of power, but from the inside, it felt more like a prison cell dressed up in silk curtains. The Communist Party had made their conditions clear. 30 years of silence. No politics, no leadership, no voice. Her only role was to stand by Mao, raise their daughter, and play the dutiful wife. For a woman as fiery and ambitious as Jiang Qing, it was suffocating. She tried to adapt. She cut her glamorous Shanghai curls, traded silk dresses for drab revolutionary uniforms, and smiled at official banquets as if she belonged. But beneath the plain clothes raged a storm. Jiang had lived her entire life chasing drama, rebellion, and reinvention. Now she was expected to stitch embroidery and nod politely while others debated China's future. Domesticity fit her about as well as stage makeup in a coal mine. She bristled at the party-wise who looked down on her, snapping at officials, clashing with women who thought her unstable and arrogant. Even small attempts to be useful collapsed into disaster. When a film was made about Mao and Jiang intended to showcase the revolutionary couple, it backfired spectacularly. Jiang dazzled on screen, poised, passionate, magnetic. Mao, by contrast, looked sedated, half asleep. The film was quickly shelved. For Jiang, it was a bitter reminder. She wasn't made for the shadows. She was born for the spotlight. Meanwhile, Mao's attention drifted elsewhere. His days were consumed by politics, but his nights were filled with affairs. Young women, often plucked from the countryside, were ushered into his orbit and into his bed. Jiang watched, powerless to stop it, her fury smoldering beneath the surface. But if Mao's heart wandered, her ambitions only sharpened. She realized something vital. Power didn't rest in affection, it rested in influence. And influence required patience. She could wait. She could outlast every rival. Time, she knew,
was on her side. In 1949, the communists triumphed over Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. The People's Republic of China was declared. Fireworks filled Beijing, Mao was hailed as the great helmsman, and Jiang Qing stood at his side as the first lady of a new nation. And yet, she was still invisible, still a ghost in the corridors of power. Behind the triumph, disaster brewed. Mao's grand experiment, the Great Leap Forward, became one of history's greatest tragedies. His rush to modernize plunged the country into famine. Tens of millions starved. His colleagues stripped him of real power, leaving him a figurehead, a relic to be honored but ignored. To most of China, Mao looked finished. To Jiang, this wasn't an ending. This was an opening. Her silence had lasted decades. Her rage was ready, and now her moment was finally coming. By the early 1960s, Mao's glory days seemed gone. The Great Leap Forward had left a trail of famine and corpses. Within the party, he was pushed aside, honored publicly but stripped of real control. For many leaders, this would have been the end. For Jiang Qing, it was the cue she had been waiting for. After 3 long decades of silence, she finally saw her chance to step back into the spotlight. During Mao's semi-retirement, Jiang Qing returned to Shanghai. On the surface, it was a friendly visit, reconnecting with old acquaintances. In reality, it was a reconnaissance. She mingled with her old theater circles, listened to gossip, studied the cultural mood. She wasn't reminiscing, she was plotting. Back in Beijing, her marriage to Mao was hollow. He surrounded himself with young mistresses. She was tolerated more than loved, but Jiang didn't care anymore. She wasn't chasing affection. She was chasing power, and she had found her weapon, culture. She began whispering in Mao's ear, pointing to plays and operas that dared to portray authority figures in a less than flattering light. To most people, they were harmless entertainment. To Jiang, they were dangerous and useful. She told Mao the cultural world was crawling with enemies, playwrights, directors, scholars, and even party veterans who were mocking him in secret. Mao, who was already paranoid about his legacy slipping away, listened, and the more Jiang stoked his fears, the more he believed.
Together, they reached a conclusion. The revolution hadn't gone far enough. Politics wasn't enough. Economics wasn't enough. The party must control not just the government, but the very soul of the nation, its culture, its art, its ideas. In 1966, Mao staged his comeback, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. For Mao, it was a way to reclaim control and destroy his rivals. For Jiang, it was the long-delayed debut she had been rehearsing for 30 years. Appointed deputy director of the Cultural Revolution Group, she finally had a stage the size of China itself. Her silenced voice erupted in fiery speeches, proclamations, and directives that reshaped the nation's cultural and political life. But this wasn't about art. It wasn't about liberation. For Jiang, it was vengeance. She began with old enemies, the critics in Shanghai who had mocked her, the directors who had rejected her, the intellectuals who had smeared her name. They all became targets. Art was censored, plays rewritten, films banned. Only revolutionary works approved by Jiang Qing survived. The actress, once silenced for 30 years, was now the director of a national theater of cruelty, and her audience, hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens, had no choice but to watch. For Jiang Qing, the revolution wasn't just political, it was personal. And as Mao's enemies fell, so too would anyone who had ever doubted her. China was about to plunge into chaos, and at the center of it all stood Jiang Qing, Mao Zedong's wife, the woman with a score to settle, and the match in her hand. For Mao, the Cultural Revolution was a comeback strategy, a way to claw back relevance after the humiliation of the Great Leap Forward. But for Jiang, it was much more. This wasn't just about politics. This was her debut.
After decades of enforced silence, she was finally stepping into the role she believed she was born to play. Her title sounded modest, Deputy Director of the Cultural Revolution Group. On paper, it looked secondary, almost ceremonial. In reality, it gave her unprecedented control over what mattered most to her: culture, art, and the minds of the people. And Jiang dove into the job with the intensity of an actress preparing for a premiere she had waited her entire life to perform. Art, literature, theater, all of it had to serve Maoist revolution. Anything else was branded poisonous weeds. Traditional operas, banned. Popular plays with open-ended conclusions, rewritten with revolutionary triumphs. She introduced model operas that glorified Mao, where every villain was a symbol of the old order and every hero was a Maoist revolutionary. These weren't plays for entertainment, they were indoctrination disguised as culture. And while she preached ideology, what drove her deepest was revenge. Many of the writers, directors, and critics who now found themselves censored, humiliated, or destroyed were the very same people who had mocked her back in Shanghai. To them, their insults had been forgotten long ago. To Jiang, they still burned fresh. Now she had power, and she wielded it with ruthless precision. But culture was just the opening act. The real drama unfolded when the revolution spilled into society itself, carried on the shoulders of a terrifying new army, the Red Guards. Millions of students, teenagers raised entirely on Maoist propaganda, were unleashed as shock troops of revolution. They carried Mao's little book as if it were scripture. They chanted slogans until their throats went hoarse. They smashed temples, looted homes, dragged teachers into the streets, and attacked anyone suspected of being a counter-revolutionary. The young saw themselves as heroes. In truth, they were instruments of destruction. Schools shut down, universities closed, intellectuals were paraded in public, beaten, sometimes killed. Ancient relics, libraries, and temples, centuries of Chinese heritage, were obliterated in days. Families were ripped apart as children denounced their parents, and neighbors betrayed one another. And behind the curtain, Jiang Qing applauded. As the hysteria spread, Jiang tightened her circle of power. She gathered 3 men who matched her zeal and ruthlessness. Zhang Chunqiao, the master propagandist. Yao Wenyan, the venomous literary critic. Wang Hongwen, a young labor leader Mao himself was grooming. Together with Jiang, they became the Gang of Four, the most feared faction in China. Where Mao provided the authority, Jiang and her allies provided the fury. Their mission wasn't just to purify culture, it was to remake the Communist Party itself, to push aside veteran leaders like Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi, whom Jiang despised as relics of an old guard that once rejected her. For the next 10 years, China became a theater of cruelty, and Jiang Qing was its director. The young cheered, the old trembled, and the entire nation bled.
The Cultural Revolution wasn't simply a political movement. It was a storm that ripped through every classroom, every workplace, and every home in China. At its heart were the Red Guards, millions of students, many barely 15 years old. They believed they were saving China's revolution. Instead, they were dismantling their country from within. Teachers, once revered as pillars of society, were dragged from classrooms, forced to wear dunce caps, and beaten by their own students. Intellectuals were denounced as bourgeois, humiliated in public squares, and often driven to suicide. Schools and universities closed their gates. An entire generation's education was stolen, replaced not with knowledge, but with chants, slogans, and endless struggle sessions. Young people who might have become doctors, scientists, or poets were instead waving red flags and wielding clubs. Meanwhile, the Red Guards turned their fury on China's cultural heritage. Temples were smashed, Confucian texts were burned, Buddhist relics were desecrated. Centuries of history were wiped away in the name of progress. And for Jiang Qing, this was triumph. After 30 years of silence, she finally had a voice, and it roared across the nation. From podiums and stages, she gave fiery speeches that whipped crowds into hysteria. She spoke like an actress commanding the stage.
Her pauses were calculated, her crescendos perfectly timed, her anger theatrical. She wasn't just speaking, she was performing. And China, whether it wanted to or not, was her audience. But behind the slogans was something darker. Jiang was settling scores. Those who'd mocked her in Shanghai, the critics who'd smeared her name, the directors who'd rejected her, she hunted them through the machinery of revolution. Some lost their careers. Others lost their lives. Every humiliation she had endured, every insult she had swallowed was now repaid in blood. As her influence expanded, she began reshaping her image. No longer merely Mao's wife, she had transformed herself into Mao's heir, the sole guardian of his thought and the future of his revolution. For some, this was frighteningly persuasive. For others, it was delusional, but no one dared challenge her openly. Inside the party, fear reigned. Veteran leaders like Liu Shaoqi were branded traitors, publicly humiliated and left to die in disgrace. Deng Xiaoping was purged, his family targeted, his career nearly destroyed. Even Mao's closest comrades weren't safe. The Cultural Revolution wasn't cleansing China, it was consuming it. And at the center of the storm, Jiang Qing smiled. For her, the chaos wasn't tragedy, it was vindication. After decades in the shadows, she finally stood in the spotlight. But for someone like Jiang, the taste of power is never enough. Once you have it, you always want more. And Jiang Qing was just getting started. By the late 1960s, Jiang Qing was no longer just Mao's wife. She had transformed herself into the cultural architect of China's revolution, wielding propaganda as her sharpest weapon. For Jiang, art wasn't beauty, it was a battlefield. Her vision was blunt and merciless. All culture must serve politics. Anything that didn't glorify Mao, the revolution, or the new China was condemned as poison. She banned nearly everything that once entertained the masses. Classical operas, romantic films, popular novels, all were declared counter-revolutionary. In their place, she unleashed her invention, the so-called model operas. These weren't ordinary performances. They were rigid, scripted lessons in loyalty. Every villain was a landlord, a capitalist, or a corrupt official. Every hero was a soldier, a peasant, or a worker guided by Maoist wisdom. The plots were predictable, the endings inevitable. But predictability was the point. They weren't meant to inspire joy, they were meant to indoctrinate. Across the country, theaters staged the same handful of approved works, night after night. The songs praising Mao echoed through cities and villages. Ballets were rewritten into revolutionary parables, where pirouettes gave way to bayonets. Even music and painting became tools of political education. But beneath the banners of ideology was something more personal. For Jiang, this wasn't just censorship, it was revenge dressed up as revolution. Many of the people she targeted during her purge of culture had links to her own past. Directors who had ignored her back in Shanghai, critics who'd mocked her, actors connected to her failed marriages, all suddenly found themselves branded enemies of the people. Careers collapsed, reputations vanished, and families were destroyed. What the nation was told was a cultural cleansing was in truth also Jiang's private vendetta. At the same time, she worked tirelessly to sculpt her own image. On podiums, she spoke with fiery conviction, echoing Mao's words while presenting herself as his most loyal disciple. State newspapers praised her as the guardian of revolutionary art. Photographs showed her standing not behind Mao, but beside him, framed in the spotlight.
It wasn't enough to be seen as Mao's wife. Jiang wanted to be his ideological equal, his heir apparent. Whispers began. Whispers she herself encouraged, comparing her not just to Mao's partner, but to Mao himself. For a woman who had once endured 30 years of silence, the transformation was intoxicating. She wasn't simply playing a role anymore, she was rewriting the cultural script of an entire nation. In 1969, she reached a milestone few could have imagined. Jiang Qing became the first woman ever appointed to the Politburo, the Communist Party's highest decision-making body. For someone who had once begged her grandparents to let her stay on stage, this was the ultimate transformation, from actress to one of the most powerful figures in the world's most populous country. But power is like a drug. Once tasted, it consumes. And for Jiang Qing, it was never enough. The Cultural Revolution had given her control over China's culture. Now, she hungered for control over its future. By the early 1970s, Jiang Qing was at the very peak of her power. She had crushed rivals, reshaped China's culture, and carved out a place for herself among the Communist Party's elite. But even as she rose, time itself was plotting against her. Mao Zedong, the man 20 years her senior, her shield and her source of legitimacy, was in steep decline. His body was failing, his strength fading. For Jiang, this was terrifying. Without Mao, her authority would collapse. She would be exposed. And so her behavior became erratic, even reckless. She flaunted her lovers openly, rebranding her promiscuity as a woman's right, a feminist freedom. She strutted through state functions like a diva, intoxicated by her own power. She gave unauthorized interviews to foreign journalists, styling herself as a global leader. She even signed autographs in red ink, a privilege once reserved for emperors. To party elders, it was madness. To Jiang, it was destiny. She no longer saw herself as Mao's wife or widow-in-waiting. She saw herself as his successor. But the people of China saw things differently. After a decade of upheaval, the nation was exhausted. The Cultural Revolution had shut down schools, torn apart families, and scarred an entire generation. Even the Red Guards, once her most loyal disciples, had grown disillusioned. In 1976, martial law was declared to restore order. The tide was shifting. And then came the inevitable. On September 9th, 1976, Mao Zedong died. For Jiang, it was the moment she had rehearsed for all her life. The curtain had fallen on Mao, and she was ready to claim the stage for herself. Together with her allies in the Gang of Four, she plotted to seize control. They drafted plans for coups in Beijing and Shanghai, gambling that they could outmaneuver Mao's surviving rivals. But their schemes were clumsy, their timing disastrous. Barely a month after Mao's death, the party struck back. On October 6, 1976, soldiers stormed Jiang Qing's quarters. She was arrested mid-script, dragged from her palace of illusions, and thrown into detention. The director of the Cultural Revolution had been cut from her own play. For years, she languished in prison, awaiting her reckoning. Then came the trial. China, still bleeding from the wounds of the Cultural Revolution, needed a villain. Mao could not be blamed. His image was too sacred. But Jiang Qing, she was perfect. She became the scapegoat, the embodiment of cruelty, arrogance, and chaos. Her defense stunned the world. Standing before the court, she declared coldly, "I was Chairman Mao's dog. Whoever he asked me to bite, I bit." There was no remorse, no apology, only defiance. In 1981, she was convicted of counter-revolutionary crimes. At first, she was sentenced to death. Later, the punishment was reduced to life imprisonment. But her reign was finished. The woman who had once dreamed of applause now faced only silence. And history had already begun writing its verdict. In prison, Jiang Qing discovered what real silence sounded like. Once the fiery voice of China's Cultural Revolution, she was now reduced to a number, stripped of titles, stripped of followers, stripped of her stage. For a woman who had lived her entire life chasing applause, performance, and conflict, obscurity itself was its own kind of death. The days turned to years. The echo of crowds, the fury of rallies, the endless speeches, all of it was gone. In its place, there was only the cold monotony of confinement and the company of memories that would not let her rest. For someone who thrived on drama,
her new role was the cruelest one imaginable. By the early 1980s, her health began to collapse. The irony was brutal. Throat cancer, the disease that attacks the very instrument she had once used to command millions, started to consume her. The voice that had thundered across China was fading into a rasp.
In 1991, she was moved to a Beijing hospital, and there, on April 14th, Jiang Qing made her final decision. She was found dead in her hospital bathroom, hanged with a length of cloth. She was 77 years old. Was it despair that finally broke her, or was it her last act of defiance? One final performance, unscripted, where she, and she alone, chose the ending. Her death was quiet, but her legacy? Anything but. For the Chinese state, Jiang Qing was the perfect scapegoat. Mao's portrait still hung over Tiananmen Square, untouchable, untarnished. The great helmsman remained a symbol of the revolution, but Jiang, she could absorb the blame. She was painted as the white-bones demon, the schemer who whispered poison into Mao's ear, the woman who turned a revolution into a nightmare. And yet, history is rarely that simple. Jiang was ruthless, ambitious, and vindictive, yes. She turned ideology into a weapon and used the revolution to settle personal scores. But she was also a woman molded by pain. The abandoned daughter of a broken home, the silenced wife forced into decades of obedience, the actress who fought for a voice in a world that never wanted her to speak. When her moment finally came, she mistook vengeance for leadership. She spoke of women's liberation, but her feminism was hollow. She wasn't fighting to lift women up. She was fighting to place herself above everyone else. The stage she built wasn't for women, it was for Jiang Qing alone. Even Mao, not known for his sharp judgment of character, once dismissed her as a paper tiger, loud, theatrical, destined to collapse. But in truth, she wasn't fragile. She was volatile, explosive, and willing to burn down everything around her just to keep the spotlight fixed on her face. What Mao got right, and what Jiang never understood, was this: the spotlight never lasts forever. In her lifetime, she achieved almost everything she had dreamed of: power, influence, a prominent place in history, but the applause she craved never came. Instead, her name became a curse, her memory a warning. Jiang Qing's story is a tragedy disguised as a triumph, a revolution turned into theater, a nation treated as an audience, and a woman who mistook cruelty for strength. In the end, she did not leave the stage to cheers. She slipped away into silence. This was Madame Mao, the actress who turned history into theater and who left the world remembering her not as a star, but as a cautionary tale.